What's going on, my people? My name is KD, and I am the host of Software Sundays, presented by Build, Learn, Impact. Our mission is to teach you how to make magic with tech. And today we're going to be going over some news, going over some questions, and exploring ways that we can improve in our careers. So, with that being said, let's start it off with story I heard about business AI usage flatlining. And so this is not a decline in any of the companies, and we're talking about large enterprises, at least 250 employees. Uh, they're not using less AI, but the number of customers and number of companies that are using AI in any amount hasn't been growing as quickly as it had in the past. I think we're currently around 45% of businesses are using AI, and that is after a very significant jump between 2024 and 2025, where right now OpenAI still leads the pack in the most market share. But even their numbers are starting to decline just a bit, not significantly, while we're seeing other providers like Google with their Gemini model and Anthropic having slightly higher increases, which is just showing that the competition in the AI space is fierce. And I'm not sure who's really going to come out ahead over time. OpenAI and ChatGPT do have the brand value, and they'll probably always have a place in the market. But there are other providers that are providing better and more valuable services. And we'll continue to see the leaderboards change as those models continue to improve. And this is not necessarily saying that there's any slowing of growth in the AI consumption market overall, right? We're not seeing like adoption go from 45% to 25% or something drastic like that. It's still holding steady, but we're not seeing companies moving as quickly to start using AI. So I think we got at least most of the companies that are, the leaders of the pack and who were interested in innovating and experimenting with something new. Now, the rest of the market, they'll probably be more slower adopters of the technology, and maybe they're waiting for, more significant changes, or maybe they're waiting for the economic environment to change so they can invest in that direction. But we can definitely see, I don't see it really reversing course, but we won't see the same uh, driving factors for growth as we have uh, so far. And I'm not saying an AI bubble story is completely off the table, but I do think it's worth watching to see what happens next. I know a few companies have said, hyperscalers in particular, have mentioned that they're not meeting the current demand for AI from their customers. And so they've been investing very, very heavily into building out that infrastructure. Hopefully, they've been building it and investing in just enough to handle the current consumption or the current demand and maybe a slight increase over time. But if they're expecting those numbers to hit 75% in the next 12 months, and that's what they're building for, we might actually notice a significant uh, number of resources being unused. So we'll see. And there is some time. Maybe it might just be the season or some other factors that are, you know, challenging the growth and the demand. But anything is still on the table at this point. But it is very interesting to keep in mind and keep an eye on as we move forward. And in the AI story, uh, something that could potentially improve the adoption, and because it just might make it easier, we're seeing OpenAI, Anthropic, and Block have agreed to develop AI standards together. And that group, and among others, has been organized by the Linux Foundation to make sure that all of the innovation being done with AI, from the model context protocol to the agents.md files and some other open source standards that you know individual companies have been adopting one by one, kind of wrapping those up together so that we can have some meaningful uh, plumbing and infrastructure for these AI systems to interact and be interoperable. Uh, that interoperability will make it much easier for greater innovation, transparency, and increased value for the tech industry, as well as all of the industries that are using AI to build and improve their products. Right now, when you have too many different standards and that are competing for market share, you start to see challenges with teams not being able to uh, one support products that they're inheriting from another team because they went in a different direction, or the integration of some of these systems becomes more difficult because they're running totally different protocols that become more challenging to uh, keep together. And it just makes the entire system more brittle. And this is not good for the overall growth and demand of AI, right? We want to make sure that it's easy for these teams to get started with AI and building their agents or any type of RAG pipelines. It it becomes more difficult to do that when you have a splintered mess of different standards that are being pushed by all of these different companies. Uh, the interesting part about it with the models themselves, and I kind of highlighted this last week, with China originally always going with open source first. And on the flip side, US companies starting with a closed source design and slowly opening up those standards to other people and up to the world. We're seeing that now, right? They've kind of gotten all of the market share they could get from having a closed source system, right? We're seeing a flatlining in growth. And so now the next thing to actually maybe improve that demand and that growth is to open source some of these standards to make it easier for new companies to adopt them without having that standard in place. It doesn't make it that easier for new companies to join the AI train. Linux as a foundation, they've been instrumental in open sourcing a number of other technologies, and just the open source community in general are incredibly important for making sure that the internet that we rely on and the software systems that we use are always reliable and uh, efficient and effective no matter the scale. And where hopefully this opens up the door to see that type of support and adoption for AI and the plumbing infrastructure that AI needs in order to continue to grow into the future and to become the type of platform that the economy and businesses can actually use over time. Trump, President Trump, has also signed an executive order seeking to block states from creating their own AI regulations. The mindset behind it is to make it easier for enterprises to operate under one national standard. Uh, Organizations prefer to have one regulation that they have to comply with versus having 50 different regulations or rules that they have to figure out how to work with and under. It makes it more difficult for them when they have so many different fractured uh, regulations to follow because it requires more resources and more energy and more time to innovate and build in those spaces. With this type of one order, one rule, it makes it easy to say this is what we can or cannot do across this number of users and these number of systems in this region. Um, I can see the benefit there. The Congress also were not able to get any type of alignment on satisfactory AI regulations at the federal level, and that's been due to a lot of different opinions about what can or cannot be done in the space. From what we know, states in the Midwest, I can't remember exactly what state right now, it could be like Ohio, they had their own, uh, or they had their own law for a AI regulation. I think specifically for data privacy and like how to train these AI systems and where they could be used uh, to make sure that there wasn't any type of bias inside of those systems that were affecting citizens' rights. Uh, the Congress is having those same challenges with understanding how do you align the incentives of developers, enterprises, and the public to make sure we aren't uh, running over any type of social rights while also understanding who would be liable if there was some type of breach of trust or security in these types of systems without having any clear guidelines in place at the federal level. And when you're relying on different states to make up their own rules, you start seeing the challenge of, we can do this here and not do this here. And so hopefully this type of order could be made to avoid that, but it's not even like clear if it'll be allowed to go through because technically you can't make an order to just regulate laws you can't stop the states from making laws specific to their type of business. Uh, and so I'm not sure what the actual outcome will look like. We'll probably find out more in the next 6 months after these orders have gone through court and people have determined whether or not they're okay or not. Uh, One moment. I think a clear regulation uh, and governance board, whether it's this executive order or some congressional law that will be put in place, would make it a lot easier for companies to operate and make decisions. I mentioned it a few weeks ago with the EU's AI Act, and sometimes the wrong regulation could stifle innovation in a space. Makes it more difficult for incumbents to operate, but even more so, it makes it more difficult for a startup to make a space inside of the industry because they don't have the resources available to comply with some of the requirements that may be pushed upon them. So having some clear guardrails in place is definitely needed for the space, and we cannot forget the we cannot forget the rights of the people at all. So whatever direction we go into has to make sure the privacy rights, the uh, the right to work, and all the other rights that people have are still maintained. And I also saw an interesting article, or not even article, like a discussion on the Golang Reddit, where participants were discussing their favorite do's and don'ts for Golang and the language, and pretty much just compiling all of their knowledge that they've gotten over time for how to work with Go in the best way. And I just wanted to share a few of those that I thought were interesting and worth uh, reiterating for everyone because they're super important. So the first one is simple is always better. It's sometimes cool to build something from scratch, to have something custom that works for your niche situation. And if you're an engineer that enjoys solving difficult problems, you may find yourself leaning toward creating more complex and distributed systems. But a lot of the time, you don't need that type of complexity inside of your solution. Whenever possible, just keep it simple. Do the thing that requires you or that allows you to solve the problem and stop. You don't have to solve for a dozen edge cases before you've ever experienced those in the wild. Your system might be susceptible to an edge case, but it might never actually meet that. And when it does, and if it happens, more than what you're comfortable with, then you start to add some complexity and see how can we make this better. And it may get less simple at that point. But you should always start with simplicity. It's easier for you, it's easier for your customers, it's easier for your team. And then number two is refactors and new features should not be in the same branch. And I've had my own challenges with this where you're looking to clean something up, but as you're cleaning something up, you decide you want to move some function around, maybe out of a class that it's been in, or you want to change the parameters that a class takes or that a function takes. And when you're just starting into it, it may seem, very simple and easy, but making those type of decisions can cause confusion as you're cleaning things up because now you may not even remember or be able to keep track of what needs to stay and what needs to go. And the blast radius of your changes will start to grow because you're moving things around, you're breaking things in a way that they don't need to be broken. So this is good hygiene for any pull request or any changes you're making to your code base or your system. Try to, again, simplicity. You want to keep things small. You want to do one thing and one thing only. If that is removing logs or changing the logs for all of your classes so that they are bubbling up to the same place and have the same format and use the same level, log level, whether it's info, debug, or something else. You want to do all of that inside of one clean branch. If you're refactoring a specific method, you want to keep your changes to that method as much as possible and try not to make changes to the callers or the functions that that calls. You can do that inside of a different branch. It's especially when you start noticing that your changes are going beyond, maybe 50 lines. 50 is actually a lot, a very large PR for someone to have to review, and it could result in some pretty significant changes inside of your project and your system. So try to avoid that as much as possible. And finally, boring works. I know it's pretty cool to use the latest technology that you've heard from a podcast or from Reddit, where they're talking about this new server or this new package that can do magic, right? But when you're building production code and you're looking to make sure your product is reliable, you don't want to have too many shiny new pieces inside. You want to make sure that the dependencies that you're using have withstood the test of time. So that means they've been inside of the standard library or they've been tried and are industry uh, best practices at this point. This is where the industry is going. Now, of course, it's nothing wrong with learning about something new, but try not to put that inside of your production quality code, your production application, because any types of breaks there are going to have a significant impact on your real users. And we don't really want that. So if you find something boring that works, just stick with it. Whenever it stops working, then you can start, thinking about brainstorming, hey, how do we make this better? Because again, we want to keep everything simple. And boring is boring, but it's very simple. And so even in that span, we are thinking about how to improve as engineers and developers in our career, in our lives. And so let's go over a few questions that came in this week on ways we can improve as an engineer and as developers.
Should I study CIS, ISO, or NIST standards?
So, any of the standards that you're going to be using are going to be very specific to the role that you're in, the company that you're in, and the industry that you're operating in. The industry will sometimes define where the standards need to be and how precise they have to be. I would say you need to study all of them, but when you're actually inside of your role, you'll actually know, like, if you're in a global company, you may have to apply the ISO standards. You may need to understand those rules more clearly. If you're in a engineering role inside of a US only company, you may be able to get away with just focusing on the CIS standards because those are more about hardening systems and applications that you're probably going to be using inside of your product. And then NIST has its own uh, benefits because it's been widely adopted in the US and across the government and different industries. So you could probably get the best of both the worlds there from a regional and uh, good balanced security perspective. I would suggest looking into NIST standards first because it gives you a strong foundation on how to secure your systems and understand what's important from an auditing perspective, from what logs are important, understanding what type of data classification you have inside of your system, and it'll give you a strong background that'll make it much easier for you to understand ISO and CIS later, depending on your organization role in the industry. Uh, it's going to be really important for an organization that is deciding which of these standards to move forward with. You have to understand your particular level of risk and the resources you have available. Some companies are a ISO house where they make sure that all of the controls that their systems need has to abide by ISO, and that may work. And you may also be able to mix and match, but it all begins with understanding the data that your company is responsible for, the type of applications and the availability that you need, and the basically the field that you're playing in. You don't need to know all of them as a junior, but as you move up into your career, especially if you're focusing on the cybersecurity space, you have to be familiar with the benefits and consequences of using one standard versus another. In my previous roles, I've actually used CIS more because I am an engineer. So I've actually had the opportunity to go through the CIS standards for the Google Kubernetes engine and understanding, hey, how do we lock down this cluster so that we are secure from a cybersecurity standpoint? How do we make it less likely for any threat actors to take over or access some data that they're not supposed to access? So that has been, in my experience, uh, a very helpful tool because it gives you some really straightforward, you know, uh, really straightforward pathway to understand, hey, this is what I can do first, this is what I can do next, and then you can decide making potentially exceptions based on your particular application to see what can stay and what needs to go.
What is the difference between PCI and PII data?
So this is why that CIS, NIST, and ISO standard are going to be really important for you to consider because PCI is specific to the payments industry, and that is applicable. I said the payments industry, but the financials services industry, where if you're dealing with any type of payments or money in transit and banking, you're going to have to understand the data security standards for payments and uh, card. I forgot what the I stands for, but uh, payment and card. yeah, PCI. I forgot what that stands for, and I think it's industry. But basically, it's more concerned with how do we secure this specific subset of financial data. PII is a more broader term to mean personally identifiable information. And that could be anything from your name to your birth date to your age, your address. These are more general fields that could represent a significant breach in data, but that may not have a financial loss. When we're thinking about PCI, there is a significant potential for actual financial loss that could be involved, or some type of fraud that can happen based on exposing this type of data. So there is a greater level of one risk for that data, but also a greater level of security that's required to secure that data. And that means making sure that you're using uh, secure services. Like you're not exposing or saving card information in plain text. You have to encrypt that type of data, or you're not just sharing transactions that a person is making with the public. That data also uh, needs to be protected, or having some type of multi-factor authentication for any type of financial applications, so that a person's data is not being exposed or their money is not being put at risk because you have one password that potentially got leaked. So there's a different standard of control that you have to have in place when you're in that industry, that financial services industry. PII is applicable for a retail uh, company, a healthcare company, because a lot of your healthcare data is PII data, and it has its own standards in place to make sure you're not violating any type of HIPAA laws. And it really it has its they have their differences for when you have to secure either. Well, you have to secure both in any circumstance, but the stringent requirements may be different for either. So whenever you're building software and you see yourself dealing with a PII or a financial application, make sure you're using reliable packages dependencies. Make sure you're not making that data public. Make sure you are considering who can and should have access to that data, because if you let the wrong field, even the expiration date for a credit card, leak, you could be in some pretty big problems. And so it's really about scope and regulation, and understanding what type of controls and auditing you have to have in order to comply with PII rules and PCI rules.
What are the 3 reasons to use AWS?
So AWS is great for speed, reliability, and security. When you use AWS or any type of cloud service provider, you're getting the benefit of a shared security model without having to invest heavily inside of the infrastructure. You get access to their global network of resources without having to build that scalability yourself. And so while AWS is providing high availability systems, they're providing built in redundancy, enterprise grade security controls that are extremely difficult for a small team to build, or even a large team that doesn't have the experience. When you use AWS, it allows you to focus on the application that you're building without having to think about the bits and pieces to how to make that work. So AWS is really helpful as a tool for teams to spin up resources quickly, where you can experiment and focus on building the core business logic for your products instead of managing hardware or figuring out how do we get the network set up or figuring out all the other things about managing a server and the compute that you need. You can just go into the console, click a few buttons, and then you'll have all of the infrastructure, the entire platform that you need to run a globally scalable application. And that gives teams a competitive advantage because it makes it possible for startups to be able to compete inside of the, you know, any industry because they're not having to recreate the infrastructure that the incumbents already have that give them their edge. And I would even say enterprises also get a benefit from having AWS and other cloud services because they, again, we can experiment more quickly without having to invest inside of the infrastructure very early on. We can see, hey, how does this work? Get some type of feedback, and then decide, do we need to recreate this infrastructure on our own premises? And that's something you can do now that you have more data before you make a significant investment because any type of servers, any type of data center that you're building or even operating is going to require a significant number of people resources, but also financial capital to build out those resources before they even become profitable. And so there's a lot of reasons to use AWS and any other cloud provider, but there's also a few different reasons why you should not. And I just highlight that AWS, while it makes it easier for you to get started and build something quickly, it does charge a premium for that service. So anything you're running inside of the cloud is going to cost you more in the long run than what it would cost you if you were building it on prem. But it doesn't have that initial startup cost. Uh, if you're not optimizing the resources that you're using inside the cloud, you're going to end up paying way more than you need to if you had just built it on your own. So whenever you're thinking about whether I should use AWS or I should use the cloud or not, you have to think about, have you built up the discipline to make sure you're turning off resources, to make sure you are thinking about and doing performance testing to see how many resources do I really need anyway? Do I need that much memory? Do I need that much storage? What data can I get rid of so I don't have over 10 terabytes of data that I'm trying to store in some, frankly, really expensive storage. So there are some benefits, but if you don't be mindful about the environment that you're playing in, then you could run across some pretty significant challenges.
What is a database?
So, a database is a system that allows applications to honestly be more reliable and They are the backbone of any application, and I say any application, any software product, whether it's your bank, whether it's your doctor's office, even Netflix, if you're watching any types of shows or movie or content on their platform, it is the backbone of those systems. It is the reason that you're able to log into your bank account and see that you have this amount of money or you made these purchases. It's the difference between us knowing that you've had this x-ray done or not having it done, where someone can, as a doctor, can go review those x-rays. Your database is the system for storing, organizing, and retrieving all of your data efficiently. So when you think of an application, a software system, they are usually doing something with the data. They're processing it. They're either saving it, what like if you input some information into a form, the application takes that form input and it'll say, "Hey, this is what I need to do with it," and it usually stores it into a database. If you're looking to view some type of data, you're gonna ask the application to pull that data from the database. And so it gets what it needs to get before giving it to you in whatever format it needs to get it as. And again, that's like your user account. How do I know you're a user in this building? Your payments. How do I know you own this vehicle, right? Like all of the data that you put inside of the DMV, when they can find who you are or find that you actually own that vehicle. Everything there is a database. And there's different types of data that can be stored, right? You can have a number being stored, or it could be some type of string like your name or your address. Uh, there's different formats. Now, I could get into this later on, but like the SQL data versus no SQL data for different types of applications. And pretty much a database makes it easier for the application to do everything it needs to do without having to own and maintain that data on its own. I think databases have been popular for over 30 years. I think before there was any databases, you still had data, but at that point there was no separation between the application and the database. So it was like the application could, if the application failed, the data might fail. Now you can kind of separate it to make it easier to scale one uh, independently from the other, which means you can have a really fast application with some slow database, or vice versa. You can move things around. A well-designed database is going to allow the business, whatever the business it may be, to operate reliably and make accurate decisions based on their data. Without a database in place, you're going to be making decisions using data that could be less than useful.
Why does source control matter?
So, source control is going to be the difference between whether or not your team can operate over the long term on large projects or not. When you're a professional software developer, you're going to have to make a lot of changes very quickly to your code base. That may be adding a button or removing some type of field or changing the way the system processes the data, maybe adding or removing some privileges or some people that you need to alert. If you were to do that without having a source control system, you would potentially overwrite different people's work, especially if you're working on a large team where everyone is kind of doing something different on the platform. or it would forget the history of what you've had in place. Like imagine you've made a bunch of changes this week and you find out at the end of the week that something broke. If you don't have a source control system in place, you won't be able to roll back those changes. Roll back meaning you won't be able to go back to the last working version of that code. So that means you would have to try to figure out what the fix was on the fly, which could lead to a downtime on your application, which means if you're a hospital, that could mean no new appointments are being booked. Or if you're a bank, that could mean no new transactions are going through. So you're potentially almost stopping all of the business that your organization does because you don't have some type of source control system in place. Real businesses need there to be some type of source control in place. One, because it allows teams and uh, like internally and externally to audit what has been released to production. It allows you to review code in a way that gives you trust that it's working as expected. And it allows you to do things with CI/CD pipelines to automate your deployments or your testing because you can share that code with other human users, but also with other automated systems so that they can actually test the code, uh, you know, on the fly or on demand, depending on how you need it to be working. But if you don't have any type of source control set up inside of your system, you're going to be finding it very difficult to maintain the quality of your code and almost impossible to effectively maintain your system over the long term. And so learn any type, not any type, but the most popular source control system in the industry right now is Git. There were a few others, but you probably won't be using them. Uh, Figure out how to create a branch or what a branch is. Figure out how to track changes across your branch and other branches. Figure out how to merge your changes with your other teammates' changes because that's what source control gives you the ability to do, and it allows you to do it at scale. That's all the questions that we had for this week. And some final thoughts. We are getting very close to the new year. And so I just wanted to share a tip or just some advice for making sure 2026 is a great year for you. So make sure you're planning your year today. Don't wait until July 1st to decide that something needs to change or that something is going to change. Figure out your resolution or your new habits or your new actions and practices today and start applying them today. Because if you do that, then you'll prepare yourself to actually maintain those changes after the new year passes. You want to make sure that you're being consistent with all of your goals. And that means you are not waiting for some day or some clock to pass to say this is when I'm going to make the change. If you know today that a change needs to happen, you have to figure out how to get that into your lifestyle today. And the easiest time to do it is right now so that you could start the new year off great. You can start it off already inside of your new flow, inside of your new habits and your new practices. And it makes it easier to keep it going throughout the year. Um, Now is the best time to be planning. Think about what you want 2027 to look like. What do you want to say you have accomplished? And I say not to anyone else, but what do you want to say to yourself when December 2026 is around us and you're like, hey, what have I done this year? How do you want to feel? How do you want to look? What have you done in that time? Think about that and then create a plan to say, this is what I need to do in order to make sure that everything that I planned actually is true when that time comes. A plan is only the first step, too, right? You have to plan and then execute. A plan without action behind it is going to fail. And it won't even fail because you didn't even try. Just planning something and thinking about it is not enough to make it happen. You have to imagine it inside of your mind and then actively work and participate inside of your life, inside of the universe, to turn that plan and that idea and that imagination into reality. So think about that today. Start today and be active inside of your plans. And also, I want to give a very great shout out to my brother, June. Happy birthday, happy King Day to you. I wish you the best. I wish you much success. I wish you good health and good peace. And everyone else who's having a birthday this month, I wish y'all the best of life. Uh, you know, sad season. That's my man's 100 grand, and I want y'all to be great. So happy birthday again to my guy. Happy birthday to everyone else, and enjoy the rest of your week. Peace out.